It's all go at the moment. Ireland, Part 6, Chapter 4. Tom Krishna and Mary Sarojini had gone to take their siesta with the gardener's children next door. In her darkened living room, Cecilia MacPhail sat alone with her memories of past happiness and the present pain of her bereavement. The clock in the kitchen struck the half hour. It was time for her to go. With a sigh she rose, put on her sandals, and walked out into the tremendous glare of the tropical afternoon. She looked up at the sky. Over the volcanoes, enormous clouds were climbing towards the zenith. In an hour it would be raining. Moving from one pool of shadow to the next, she made her way along the tree-lined path. With a sudden rattle of quills, a flock of pigeons broke out of one of the towering peepal trees. Green-winged and coral-billed, their breasts changing colour in the light like mother of pearl, they flew off towards the forest. How beautiful they were, how unutterably lovely. Susila was on the point of turning to catch the expression of delight on Dugald's upturned face. Then, checking herself, she looked down at the ground. There was no Dugald any more. There was only this pain, like the pain of the phantom limb that goes on haunting the imagination, haunting even the perceptions of those who have undergone an amputation. Amputation, she whispered to herself. Amputation. Feeling her eyes fill with tears, she broke off. Amputation was no excuse for self-pity, and, for all that Dugald was dead, the birds were as beautiful as ever, and her children, all the other children, had as much need to be loved and helped and taught. If his absence was so constantly present, that was to remind her that henceforward she must love for two, live for two, take thought for two, must perceive and understand not merely with her own eyes and mind, but with the mind and eyes that had been his and, before the catastrophe, hers too, in a communion of delight and intelligence. But here was the doctor's bungalow. She mounted the steps, crossed the veranda, and walked into the living room. Her father-in-law was seated near the window, sipping cold tea from an earthenware mug and reading the Journal de Mycologie. He looked up as she approached and gave her a welcoming smile. "Susila, my dear, I'm so glad you were able to come." She bent down and kissed his stubbly cheek. "What's all this I hear from Mary Sarojini?" she asked. "Is it true she found a castaway?" "From England, but via China, Rindang, and a shipwreck. A journalist." "What's he like?" "The physique of a messiah, but too clever to believe in God or to be convinced of his own mission, and too sensitive, even if he were convinced, to carry it out. His muscles would like to act, and his feelings would like to believe, but his nerve endings and his cleverness won't allow it. So I suppose he's very unhappy. So unhappy that he has to laugh like a hyena." "Does he know he laughs like a hyena?" "Knows, and is rather proud of it. Even makes epigrams about it. I'm the man who won't take yes for an answer." "Is he badly hurt?" she asked. "Not badly, but he's running a temperature. I've started him on antibiotics. Now it's up to you to raise his resistance and give the vis medicatrix naturae a chance." "I'll do my best." Then, after a silence, "I went to see Lakshmi," she said, "on my way back from school." "How did you find her?" "About the same. No, perhaps a little weaker than yesterday. That's what I felt when I saw her this morning. Luckily the pain doesn't seem to get any worse. We can still handle it psychologically. And today we worked on the nausea. She was able to drink something. I don't think there'll be any more need for intravenous fluids." "Thank goodness," he said. "Those IVs were a torture. Such enormous courage in the face of every real danger. Whenever it was a question of a hypodermic or a needle in a vein, the most abject and irrational terror. He thought of the time, in the early days of their marriage, when he had lost his temper and called her a coward for making such a fuss. Lakshmi had cried and, having submitted to her martyrdom, had heaped coals of fire upon his head by begging to be forgiven. Lakshmi, Lakshmi, and now in a few days she would be dead, after 37 years. "What did you talk about?" he asked aloud. "Nothing in particular," Susila answered. But the truth was that they had talked about Dugald, and that she couldn't bring herself to repeat what had passed between them. "My first baby," the dying woman had whispered. "I didn't know that babies could be so beautiful." In their skull-deep, skull-dark sockets the eyes had brightened, the bloodless lips had smiled. "Such tiny, tiny hands," the faint, hoarse voice went on. "Such a greedy little mouth." And an almost fleshless hand tremblingly touched the place where, before last year's operation, her breast had been. "I never knew," she repeated, and, before the event, how could she have known? It had been a revelation, an apocalypse of touch and love. "Do you know what I mean?" And Susila had nodded. Of course she knew. Had known it in relation to her own 2 children, known it in those other apocalypses of touch and love, with the man that little Dugald of the tiny hands and greedy mouth had grown into. "I used to be afraid for him," the dying woman had whispered. "He was so strong, such a tyrant. He could have hurt and bullied and destroyed. If he'd married another woman. I'm so thankful it was you." From the place where the breast had been, the fleshless hand moved out and came to rest on Susila's arm. She had bent her head and kissed it. They were both crying. Dr. MacPhail sighed, looked up and, like a man who has climbed out of the water, gave himself a little shake. "The castaway's name is Farnaby," he said. "Will Farnaby." "Will Farnaby," Susila repeated. "Well, I'd better go and see what I can do for him." She turned and walked away. Dr. MacPhail looked after her, then leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought of his son, he thought of his wife, of Lakshmi slowly wasting to extinction, of Dugald like a bright fiery flame suddenly snuffed out. Thought of the incomprehensible sequence of changes and chances that make up a life, all the beauties and horrors and absurdities whose conjunctions create the uninterpretable and yet divinely significant pattern of human destiny. "Poor girl," he said to himself, remembering the look on Susila's face when he had told her of what had happened to Dugald. "Poor girl." Meanwhile, there was this article on hallucinogenic mushrooms in the Journal de Mycologie. That was another of the irrelevancies that somehow took its place in the pattern. The words of one of the old Raja's queer little poems came to his mind. "All things to all things, perfectly indifferent, perfectly work together, in discord for a good beyond, good for a being more, timeless in transience more, eternal in its dwindling than God there in heaven." The door creaked, and an instant later Will heard light footsteps and the rustle of skirts. Then a hand was laid on his shoulder, and a woman's voice, low-pitched and musical, asked him how he was feeling. "I'm feeling miserable," he answered, without opening his eyes. There was no self-pity in his tone, no appeal for sympathy, only the angry matter-of-factness of a stoic who has finally grown sick of the long farce of impassibility and is resentfully blurting out the truth. "I'm feeling miserable." The hand touched him again. "I'm Susila MacPhail," said the voice, "Mary Sorrigini's mother.